British long-range missiles, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, could be used to strike Russian territory. This is a big shift in Western policy.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I wonder what you make of this consideration that Donald Trump is giving.
Well, it's an easy comment for him to make because a lot of allies are talking about the 2% of GDP, which is the goal today, that it's not enough. As we're dealing with Putin and the reconstitution of the Russian military and the state of the battlefield in Ukraine, Europe is starting to get really nervous about this. And so I think at the July summit here in Washington, NATO allies might very well ask to go at least to 2.5 to raise that goal. So Trump coming online and saying 3%, but he's a bit behind the curve this time because I think allies are going to go in that direction anyway.
Well, and the UK is already committing to 2.5% by 2030. I mean, okay, it'll take some time for that to come on board. So, I mean, is this a sort of direction of travel? Donald Trump would settle for something less than 3% if he became president, or is it more threatening than that?
Well, I think Donald Trump repeats the first name that someone plants in his head, and so as you point out, the Polish government was there planting that seed, and I think Trump's going to hold on to the 3%. He doesn't even know what all that means.
Mm.
He's using that 3% because someone told him that. And I don't think he'll certainly back off it. He'll, if he becomes president, he'll demand 3% and maybe even jump it up a bit if someone suggests that to him. But I
Yeah.
think that's going to be the travel that allies are going to take coming up. Is this going to get? It's going to be a higher goal now.
And obviously, when Trump said back in February that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to any NATO member not meeting the 2% spending target, there was quite a lot of alarm. Um, if he does become president again, how do you think he'll handle NATO and protection of Europe, which is obviously very key to people over here?
Well, it's a great question, and it's important to us over here too.
Mm.
What he might do, and we don't really know. He's a lot of bluff and bluster, but we do know from his 4 years before that he came close to saying that he would pull the U.S. out of NATO, whatever that means. I mean, certainly disengage the U.S. a bit more from the alliance or from Europe, pull forces and put them in different places. He wanted to move U.S. forces out of Germany and put them somewhere else. So his track record shows that he doesn't have Europe or NATO in a very good light. So I think when he comes into power, if that happens, if he becomes president, that's something that's definitely a credible worry on both sides of the Atlantic.
And there was a fascinating interview in today's Times, reflecting what the Ukrainians think about what's happened to their country and the fact that the feeling that really they're on their own and they've been waiting so long for this assistance from the US, for example, that when push comes to shove, for all the talk, actually you're on your own. And I wonder whether that's the reality of it, that Europe feels precarious and threatened by these comments that Donald Trump made, because there's a recognition that really, if we do end up in World War III, something we're already there, if we do end up in a sort of greater conflagration, it's kind of every man for himself.
Well, that's a really interesting point. If you talk to the Finns, they think that from World War II, they felt that they were left alone. UK did too, if you remember. There was a feeling UK was left alone as the US was neutral. So I think history has shown that every man for himself, if you will, is kind of the base understanding. But the difference, though, is that we do have commitments under NATO,
Mm.
under Article 5. And so there is that. And that wasn't around for the Finns or for the UK in World War II. It's present now. If Trump becomes the president, how steady is that commitment?
Yeah. Is it
That's a
worth the
question.
paper it's written on?
Well, could be.
Mm. And I wonder if that, with that consideration that people are really, every individual country is thinking they need to ramp up their own defences, how doable is it to get to 2%, 2.5%, 3% and beyond, given the state of many countries' economies?
Well, that's exactly the point. We can go at the NATO summit and have that as the goal, and all the heads of state and government can agree. But it's going to be hard getting there. Increasing defense spending is difficult, even when the wolf is at your door. And I think you can hear a lot of people saying that the bear, in this case, is at the door.
Mm.
So I think that we have a better chance of ramping up the defense spending and the military capability that's got to be purchased with that, I think we've got a better shot at it than we did 5 or 10 years ago. But still, it's going to call for European leadership. It's going to call for leadership from the United States. And that's the key, is the leaders who say, we're going to make this work. And they act together, whether it's bilateral with the nations themselves or it's through NATO, but it's taking action and not sitting and dithering. That's the problem, and that's what leadership has got to make sure doesn't happen.
Well, and that brings to mind the old adage about America picking up the phone to Europe. Who do they speak to? I mean, who is the European leader that impresses America most at the moment?
Well, I tell you, the European leader who's talking the most is President Macron of France. He gave that speech at the Sorbonne. The Economist interviewed him. He has been really ringing the alarm bell loudly. And he's involving the UK in this. This isn't just the EU. He's talking about Europe. So in terms of European leadership right now, the one you hear about is Macron. In terms of impressing the US, I think right now we are so deeply involved in the unrest in our campuses because of Gaza, the presidential politics. There's a lot to distract Americans.
Right. Well, and you mentioned Gaza there, which brings me to my final question, really. Donald Trump's been making this kind of anti-war case to American voters with pledges to stop the fighting in both Ukraine and Gaza. Is that going to get traction, do you think?
Well, it just might, in the sense of Gaza, particularly. Gaza has caused a lot of unrest across the U.S. It's gotten very emotional, and I don't think the Biden administration has been able to quiet the waters here. If Trump rolls in and makes big promises about bringing peace and all that type of thing, people might be at a point now where they would actually listen to him, not understanding that he's a lot of talk and not a lot of action.
And Gaza, Gaza could end up being pretty crucial in the coming US election campaign.
That's absolutely right. I think already Biden will be losing a lot of the youth vote. And votes from others who look over at what's happening in the Middle East and are horrified by just the tragedy of it all, and aren't happy with U.S. policies that might have voted for Biden to begin with, but they might not. They might change their vote. Not that they would vote for Trump, but either they wouldn't vote at all or they vote for a third party. And those kinds of votes are votes for Trump. If you're not voting for Biden, you're voting for Mickey Mouse. That's a vote for Trump.
Well, let's speak now to our defence and political correspondent for The Times, George Grylls. George, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Just expand a little bit on what David Cameron is promising there.
I think what is most significant was where he said that British long-range missiles, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, could be used to strike Russian territory. This is a big shift in Western policy. Ukraine has, of its own accord, launched small sort of symbolic attacks, using sort of domestically produced long-range drones, but also these kind of bands of troops to sort of launch forays across the border. So they have actually been striking Russia, but not in a sort of concerted way that has any huge effect. Now, Cameron has basically given Ukraine license to use sophisticated Western cruise missiles to strike across the border into Russia. Now, that really is a significant step up.
And Russia's reaction, I mean, I guess predictable in many ways, another very dangerous statement, they said. But is there a risk here that this whole thing sort of escalates the tensions?
That's what Russia would like us to think here in the West. And let's cast our minds back to 2022 and the beginning of the full-scale invasion, where there were all sorts of sort of apocalyptic, visions coming out of Moscow because the UK had sent a few anti-tank missiles. What the West has tried to calibrate throughout its support for Ukraine is sort of ratcheting up the level, the threshold at which it requires a Russian retaliation. And they've called the Russian bluff so many times before, it felt like only a matter of time. And the UK's real use throughout this conflict, it's not the biggest donor of military aid or anything, is that always it's been the country that's pushed the boat out the furthest. It hasn't ever given the most amount. It hasn't given the most tanks. It hasn't given the most, artillery or whatever it may be. But usually it increases that threshold and allows other countries to give more powerful weapons as well. So the UK was the first to give Storm Shadow cruise missiles France followed with its Scalp missiles. Now the US is going with its ATACMS as well. And up until now, the Ukrainians have had.
Oh, George, I think I might have just lost you there, which is a shame because I was going to ask you about Emmanuel Macron's latest intervention, asking about whether the West would have to consider whether to send ground troops to Ukraine. I don't know whether you caught that, George. Just a final thought from you on Emmanuel Macron talking about the West having to consider whether to send ground troops to Ukraine. Been the reaction to that?
Yeah, again, predictably from Russia, he's actually reiterating something that he had previously said. He said it first. Germany basically said there's no way on earth we would ever do that. But the point is to try and blur those lines so that Russia doesn't really understand what the limits of Western support for Ukraine are, how far the West will go. I think in reality it's very unlikely that France or any other European country would put boots on the ground in Ukraine, but it's about not ruling it out. It's about making it a problem for Russia, for them not to be able to count that is definitely going to happen or not.
Indeed. George Grylls, thank you very much, defence and political correspondent for The Times.